Well, welcome back to Destination Aviation. I'm your host, Jeff Miller. Today we have another great interview, another author, and this one is Kevin Hazzard of the book No One's Coming. The book tells of a story of Phoenix Air, a small aviation company that becomes as a last call for the U.S. government when missions are too dangerous, too complex, or too unconventional for anyone else. From transporting Ebola patients and specifically designed aircraft to moving weapons and sensitive materials into unstable regions, Phoenix Air operates in the gray space between civil aviation and national security. At the center of all is the mindset. When the world runs out of options, no one's coming. This is written by Kevin Hazzard. The book isn't just about aviation, it's about risk, responsibility, and the people willing to say yes when everything is on the line. So Kevin has a bit of a background. He was a paramedic. He was also a journalist, and now he's the three-time author. So we'll get right into that conversation with Kevin. Kevin, welcome to Destination Aviation.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to be here.
Now, I'll say this up front, but you've probably heard it a million times because I know you've done a ton of interviews, but Kevin Hazzard seems to be a good name for you considering your background.
If I could tell you how many times I have leaned over a patient and had them like look up at my name tag as it's like, flapping in the air and them go, wait a minute, is that your real name? Yeah, it's, I was well named. What can I say? I was well named.
You were well named. And yeah, I did a brief introduction for you before we get into it. Obviously, this is a aviation-oriented podcast, but paramedic in your previous life, correct?
Yeah. About a decade on the ambulance.
It's interesting. This is year 25 for me in aviation, and I have met so many paramedics that have transitioned into aviation or just were doing it kind of both ends. Either they were recreational flyer. When I first started my career, he was a paramedic and he was also a flight instructor. So he would be a paramedic and then he would be a flight instructor. And so it seems to go somewhat hand in hand. I know, be like, that seems a weird thing to go hand in hand, but I've seen it a lot in my career.
Yeah, I feel like there's some weird adventure, risk-taking thing, something like that, like being a paramedic is very much like you're on your own kind of situation. And when you're flying a plane, obviously same concept. So I think those two worlds marry quite well.
Yeah, it seems, I think you're spot on there. There probably is that same personality type that goes for both sides there. But you've recently wrote a book, No One's Coming, which I guess goes to what you just said. You're kind of on your own. No One's Coming, correct? Which is your third book, correct?
Yeah, it is. Yep.
And your first two books, at least from what I saw, I've read this book, and thank you for sending that along to me. I loved it. We'll get into it a little bit here, but I started reading it on a flight to Washington, D.C., and I was like, oh, look at that. That all kind of connects together. Flight and we'll get into more of the details of the book, but the Washington, D.C. will make sense to people when they start figuring out who the client was. But no, it was a great read. But the first two books are really structured around and I apologize, but then when I went and looked at them, 1,000 Naked Strangers and then American Sirens. And I'm assuming the Naked Strangers were around paramedic activities.
Yeah. That was a memoir of the decade that I spent on the ambulance. And the title comes from this conversation I had. I was with a patient. We were transporting somebody to the hospital. So I was driving that particular day. I'm sitting up front and there's this family member sitting next to me. And she's like, what's this job like? Kind of like an offhanded question. And I didn't, people ask that all the time. And I don't know where this came from. It just popped into my head. And I was like, well, it's like being invited into the houses of 1,000 naked strangers, one after another after another. And, the joke was like, one, let's be honest, a lot of people when they have their emergency are pantless. So there's that. And then the other is, just like a comment on the vulnerability of people in these moments. And that's where the title came from. It just like, it was one of those things that popped into my head, but it had enough punch that I thought, yeah, okay, let's stick with that. And then American Sirens was about the birth of the paramedic. It's a history that I didn't know, having worked in the field. Most people who worked in the field did not know. A lot of the medical community didn't know, but it was how in Pittsburgh in the late 1960s, the world's first paramedics became 24 black men from a neighborhood called The Hill. And, how they became the paramedics, how the medicine itself evolved is just a fascinating story. And I was able, in writing it to help bring attention to, these pioneers. I mean, like you can't you can't meet the first cop. You're not going to meet the first doctor, but you
Yeah.
can actually, there's still about 6 or 7 of the world's first paramedics left, and you can sit
Yeah.
down and talk to them. So it was just fascinating to be, in proximity to history like that. But this one, yeah, this one's a deviation. This one's much more aviation. It's much more contagious viruses.
All the
It's
good
different.
stuff. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I spent some time in Pittsburgh, and I obviously went and looked a little bit, cheated before I got on with you to see what you've done in your past. And I didn't know though it was in Pittsburgh. That's fascinating. And I actually will
Mhm.
go read that now. Just my own curiosity from being in the area, and also too, to your point that people are still around that kind of created what a paramedic
Mhm.
is. That's surprising to me as just a person on earth that is still so new and fresh that people are still alive that actually created that career field.
Yeah,
So no, it's
yeah.
fascinating. So maybe just, well, usually up front people kind of like to know who they know me at this point. They've heard enough about me. But maybe a little bit of your background, how you became a paramedic, and then what made you become an author.
I was a reporter when I got out of college. Was working for daily newspapers, did some weekly newspaper writing, and then 9/11 happened. We live in a weird time now, but if you look back to 9/11, there was this, in the immediate aftermath, there was this tremendous sense of collectivism. Everybody, we were all part of something that had been struck. We felt we were in this together, and everybody was kind of doing their part. And, here I am writing these stories about, I'm just like covering city council meetings. And at one point, I wrote a story about speed bumps, like a story about speed bumps. So I'm sitting there, like calculating how much asphalt goes into not just a speed bump, but a speed hump, which are
I
those
was
big
just going to
things that they
ask
put over
you
the.
the hump.
Yeah, there's a difference. And a speed
I know
hump,
there
is what
is.
they put through a
I know.
neighborhood, yeah, to slow you
Yes.
down so you don't run over a child or whatever. And so that's what the story was about. And I had dinner with a friend of mine who was in the Marines, and he was home very briefly. But he had been among the first convoy of Marines to go into Iraq. And so he's telling stories about like
Yeah. Wow.
being close enough to helicopters to feel the heat coming off the rockets. And
Wow.
I'm just thinking to myself, okay, I didn't, the military was not in my plan, but here are these people, friends of mine, my generation, going off on this thing that is, it's going to be, the defining world event of our time. And I'm writing about speed humps. Maybe I ought to be doing something different. And again, that collective idea, post 9/11 kicked in. And I wrote a story about rescuers. And it was this high angle technical rescue team that they have in Atlanta. They had gone to a sewer collapse, and I was there when they came back up from this. It was this huge, huge project. Imagine this hole in the earth that's like hundreds of yards wide, hundreds of yards deep. The guys who were working on it were on scaffolding. The
Wow.
scaffolding collapsed. They disappear into the earth. What
Wow.
ultimately comes out of that hole are bodies. But the way that they carried themselves, watching them come up and watching them work, I just thought, okay, these guys have been in touch with something. Like they have an understanding of the universe, of life, of death, of just things that matter in a way that I don't, 24-year-old, 23, I guess, you know. And so that was sort of my moment where I just said, oh, okay, this is a thing that I'll do. And so I, went back to school to become a paramedic.
Wow. Wow. Is this in Georgia? Is this where you grew up or?
I didn't grow up in Atlanta. I've moved all around. I grew up in upstate New York.
Okay.
I went to college in Charleston. Then I was living in Atlanta at the time. Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting because, I've been in aviation now going on 25 years, and the speed hump thing has been revolving, because we have them in front of terminals sometimes, right? But it's interesting because I worked in Laredo, Texas for a while, and they got speed hump crazy there. They put speed humps all over the place. And it was the fire department, the paramedics that were like, hey, you're slowing down our response times. Like, we understand this part of trying to slow people down in the neighborhood, but when there's an emergency, we have to slow down. And so it was an interesting, you don't think about those type of activities and how they all kind of relate, but it seems to be something that's
Hmm.
popped in and out a lot of times. So I will give you kudos for at least
Yeah.
writing on it, because when you think about it, some people say, I should have thrown it out in the street. But it
I mean,
sounded
look,
like
not to belabor the speed hump thing, but which we have beaten this horse to death. I will just say it is way more controversial than you would think. Like, that's why I wrote the story, was that you put it up in a neighborhood and you think like everybody's going to be for this. People are really against it. So no, again, like nobody has ever talked about speed humps as much as we have. We can now do the speed hump podcast, the Jeff Miller, Kevin Hazzard speed hump podcast. But yeah, it's a weird topic, and it touches people. It really touches people.
And to belabor this one last time, but I'm going to have to say it. When I worked in South Bend, Indiana for a while, and my office was a glass window, and it was right along curbside. And I was sitting in my office one morning, and this car, they were doing a Fast and Furious thing, right? And boom, and I see it out my window go up and then down, right? And I walk out there, slightly jogged out there, and, it was a young kid. And I'm like, hey, what happened? He's like, I don't know, man. I was just going slow. And, my car ended up like this. And I was like, oh, yeah, you're going slow. Dukes of Hazzard, wheels busted, muffler hanging in the street. I'm like, yeah, it looks like you're going real slow. Okay, that was the last thing I say
going slow.
in my life, I swear, on speed bumps, humps. But so to No One's Coming, because it is a very interesting tale. And our listeners, we have a large group that either are in aviation, pilots, engineers, airport people like myself. But we also have a lot of people that are just interested in aviation. And so I think the way that you've tied this in works really well, one, for my podcast. So thank you for allowing me to ask you some questions beyond just speed humps, I swear to God. But part of the story really centers around this company, Phoenix Air, which is based in Georgia, correct?
Yeah, just outside, called Cartersville.
And so, obviously, me being an aviation nerd, I looked up the airport to see what they have going on. And could you maybe just talk a little bit about, so you went from really being in journalism, it sounded like, then because of the events, 9/11, what you saw just kind of purpose to kind of redirect, you became a paramedic. Fast forward, you're no longer a paramedic, right? You spent about a decade doing that. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then started writing books, wrote your first two books we just talked about, this third book. Can you kind of talk about that process and how you got connected with Phoenix Air?
Phoenix was started by a pair of brothers, Mark and Dent Thompson. It was Mark's idea. Mark was a pilot in Vietnam, gets discharged as they're drawing down. So he never gets sent anywhere. So essentially, he found himself an overtrained but under-practiced helicopter pilot in a world that didn't need people like that. So he gets his fixed wing because he wants to skydive, which again, it's a perfect introduction to the brothers. Like, I'm going to learn how to fly planes because I really want to jump out of them. Like, that tells you like all you need to know about how these guys live their lives. And Mark goes out, he starts an aviation company, which very quickly gets lost in a hostile takeover to his own partners. He goes on vacation, and basically while he's gone, they just sort of take it from underneath him.
Wow.
So he starts another company, which he names Phoenix as sort of a nod to rising from the ashes of his first effort.
That makes total sense.
And he starts failing because everybody was doing what he was doing, which was rushing parts to automobile assembly lines. So he's struggling. And he, his brother Dent, who was at that time working in like PR, essentially marketing for Disney. Dent had sort of worked his way up at Disney World and had a big role, but burned out on it and decided to come home and join his brother. So that's sort of the very beginning nascent moment of Phoenix Air. His brother Dent, who is Mark's opposite in every conceivable way, would never fly nor leap from an airplane. Dent had been, when he was in college, he'd worked as an EMT on ambulances in Atlanta. And somebody that he knew from those days is now a fire chief in one of the outlying counties, read my first book, 1,000 Naked Strangers, which of course, is the story of what it's like to be on an ambulance in a major metropolitan area. He gave a copy of that book to Dent. And I get this email, this is probably like 2017, from this guy I've never met, just a random person saying, hey man, read your book, liked it. I worked on EMS way back in the Wild West days of the 70s, thought this was fun. Let's keep in touch. which is sort of dense way. Like he is one of those people who collects contacts, like the way that other people might collect stamps. He just has that personality.
Yeah.
And so we just stayed in contact, and I was aware that he and his brother ran this company. I wasn't really aware of what they did. And then 2014, the events of 2014 were retold in a Popular Mechanics story, which I think came out in 2018 maybe. But it was about the design of this technology that they have, that made them quite, they were already unique, but it made them quite unique. And I read that and I thought, well, man, this is kind of a wild story. We moved back to Atlanta at sort of tail end, later part of the pandemic. My father-in-law was living here by himself. And so we came back to, bring some family to the area. So I called Dent. I was like, hey, man, I'd love to come on out and see. And he gives me this tour of, he brings me through the hangars and the flight line and air traffic control and their engineering areas, which, as we'll probably talk about, like they modify all their own stuff and they fabricate a lot of their own stuff. And, there's this rectangle of tape on the floor in one of the hangars. And, hangars are massive, massive buildings. Sort of all by itself, there's this random rectangle of tape that is scuffed and beaten up and, it's sort of white duct tape. And I said, what is that? And without any context, by the way, this is the answer, was, well, when we were developing the aero biocontainment system, we knew what we needed, but we didn't know how much space we had. And so somebody walked out the dimensions that would be available inside the passenger compartment of a Gulfstream 3 aircraft, and we laid it out on the floor just to see how little space we actually had to work with. And there was something in that moment of like, picturing two engineers, a pilot and a doctor at night in a hangar, walking out the dimensions of the space in which they were going to try to build this impossibly, futuristic piece of technology that didn't exist anywhere in the world and that many people didn't think was possible to create, that they put it there, and that they were confined to such a tremendous degree that they had this like little strip. I mean, it's like 8x4. And there was something in that moment that they were creating a patient treatment area in something that small, with very little time to do it and with no real guidance of how something like this should be done, that it felt very Apollo 13. You remember that moment where the guy turns around, he goes, we got to fit this into this using nothing but these.
Yes.
That's what that felt like. I just knew, like, I didn't know anything about what they created. I didn't know why they created it. I just knew that they had almost no space to work in, and they needed to create something that could treat very, very sick people. And so I knew that, like, that just felt like a dramatic moment to me of people sitting around, like, how do we even work on this impossible problem? And, so I went back to that 2018 article and I read a bit about the transports. And, spoiler alert, the disease is Ebola, about as scary a thing as you can possibly have.
Yes.
And the thought of, crawling into a plane for a transatlantic flight with Ebola is pretty scary to me. So I reached out to Dent and I said, man, there's got to be a story in this thing. Would you be willing to let me write this? And so we started talking about it, and very quickly, the answer was yes. But one thing he said to me was, we've got this pilot named Darren, and the night before he left, his family was so scared for him that they threw him a Last Supper because they were afraid, like, hey, if you die, we want to at least have dinner with you one last time. And then he said, Darren's the only one whose family who didn't show up for the supper because he went out with a girl. And I right away, I was like, this thing has drama, it has stakes, but it's got humor. Like, it's got crazy people. Like, I'm in. I don't know what else is behind the curtain, but I'm all in on whatever this story is. And so that was the germ. It was like, that's the breadcrumb trail that leads us to this moment right here.
And so with Phoenix Air, because in my side of the world, right, we know, like in Laredo, it was a big cargo airport. And so, people in my industry, people that listen to this, they see those types, the Colettas, IFLs of the world, those cargo operators. A lot of it is high-end net, value material that needs to get there just in time. Laredo was a lot of automotive, like, molds that they were actually using for the vehicles that they would fly, and then all the parts would come on the train, so the more expensive side to it. But Phoenix and Phoenix Air, I guess we go by, right, what they really have done with their cornerstone is they're willing to take on missions that nobody else is or at least very few are willing to take on to like the Ebola, right? They're taking on to the State Department and those type of contracts where they're saying, yeah, we'll do that, where others are saying we're not. And I know you talked about the two brothers, but that's kind of the thought, right, of the book is one's, yeah, we'll do it. We'll take that. Where other operators are like, yeah, let's think about that.
Completely. I mean, so you mentioned Laredo, places like that had big operations. When Phoenix Air starts, they're literally bumming, no exaggeration, they're literally bumming gas money from their dad to fly their jets. Like this is a 2-person operation. Mark's the only pilot. Dent is the only person on the ground. So they're being, outbid and outgunned by everybody else. And whatever money they do make, they're just putting right back into the company. They're one of a million operators trying to do this exact same thing. And they're about as small as it can possibly get. So there's a realization very early on, like, this isn't a viable business model. We're one of a million people. We will eventually go out of business. Like, this is a path to extinction. How do we differentiate ourselves? Like, how do we stand out? And so they have this sort of like 2-person come to Jesus moment where Dent sits him down and goes, man, I've gone through the books. Like, this company, like, our lifeline is very, very short. Do you have a plan for like, is there anything else we can do? And, and it like go back to, hi, my name is Mark Thompson. I learned to fly fixed wing so I could jump out of fixed wing. That's the mentality we're dealing with. He says, yeah, I do have an idea. And so Dent's like, hey, I'm all ears. Let's hear it. What do you got? And Mark just goes, explosives. And Dent's like, but, he goes in and he's like, look, there's dynamite and blasting caps and all these things that need to be flown everywhere all the time. And there's 2 good things about it. 1, it's so dangerous that nobody wants to do it. And 2, the people who are doing it are oftentimes breaking FAA regulations. Because he was flying everywhere, he's meeting everyone. Pilots anywhere he goes, small circle. So he's talking to these guys, and they're leaving their aircraft unattended overnight, packed full of explosives on runways, totally illegal. And Mark figures, okay, so these guys, like, they're kind of crazy. They're not following rules. They're going to get found out. They're going to get run out of business. If we can be their kind of crazy, but not their kind of careless, then like we're in. And Dent's listening to this. And imagine somebody comes to you and is like, hey, how are we going to keep our business alive? And the answer that they give you is explosives. Most people at that point, like that's the moment, where most people are like, but that's what they do. And so, Mark is the idea guy, but he is not the follow through guy. He's sort of like the big thinker. His business philosophy, I was talking to him one day and he said, I never had a plan. There was never a direction for the company. I just didn't want to be bored. So that's what I do. If I see something that sounds fun, I go for it. If I see something that seems like it's going to be boring, I'm out. Well, FAA regulations, boring. But that's what becomes Dent. So Dent, makes them, there's a term for it. I'm drawing a blank. It's like closed facility, something facility, that like the Department of Defense and all these other government agencies. You're basically an approved person to be able to handle all these dangerous things. So they do. They go from explosives to high explosives. That's when it's a cleared facility. They become a cleared facility. So then they can work with the Department of Defense. They start flying warheads around. In fact, the Gulf War is about to kick off and in the late 80s, early 90s. And they realize that the U.S. military realizes that they have brought the wrong Patriot warheads. Like they're missing the Scud missiles. There's like some sort of computer thing wrong. And so they need to get these new warheads in, and they call these guys and they're like, hey, we do this. It's got to be done like right now, like jump on these planes, fly these warheads, and Dent's like, wait a minute, you want us to fly warheads? And they're like, yeah, because of the way the situation's going, we can't really be seen like flying military jets with hardware into this. And it happened so fast that there's no official approval of this. And Dent's like, hey, look, I'm going to be sending my pilots around the world in small aircraft full of military grade weapons. We need something to say that like these guys aren't terrorists or gun runners and that they're not just going to be tossed, in some Turkish prison. And so they have just like a letter, basically a get out of jail card from the Department of Defense saying like, hey, these guys are cool. Don't arrest them. And so they go, and it involves this like crazy multinational back chain that involves like this Dutch diplomat, like it's a great, but that's what they do. And so, they just, every time anyone else would say no,
Yeah.
planes full of downwell charges, planes full of warheads, grenades. At one point they fly Gaddafi's suitcase nuke, which is a whole big crazy story. That alone could be its own, but I mean, it's a wild
The
story.
Libya,
that they
right?
have-
With I remember seeing that in there. That
yeah.
was
I mean, it's insane, but then they begin to move into medical transports and sticking true to their philosophy. They're not just going to take any patient. They're going to take, like, what patient does nobody else want? And the answer to that, of course, is like communicable diseases. Like, who wants to be stuck in a plane with smallpox? Like, nobody.
Nobody.
So they're like, that's what we'll be. Yeah, that's what we'll be. We'll be the smallpox guys. And so, it keeps going. That is
To
how
put
they
that on
make
a
their mark
tagline.
in the world.
Um,
Yeah.
I went and looked at their website, and it looked like they had a flight training and a bunch of stuff there. But one thing that I did miss, which one thing you just mentioned with the Gulf War, I was thinking Ebola, that was around like 2014, 2015, is that when
2014,
that
yep.
Ebola, 2014 Ebola outbreak. But Phoenix Air has been around since, now that you referenced the Gulf War, so the early 90s. Is that when
They were
came
formed in the
into-
early 80s.
Oh, early 80s. Okay. So obviously the company is probably much larger now than just two people. At least from their website, it looked like it was a pretty large company, right? Is that
You'd be shocked. The brain trust is still like 6 people.
Okay.
Now they have kind of, they have a small army of pilots. They have a large, I say large, medical corps. They've got, some doctors and nurses and medics. They have engineers and they have fabricators, people who work in the machine shop. But, it is not massive. It still very much looks like a family-run company. It's a couple hundred employees.
And I would assume that structure is a family-run company, right? They haven't sold out any portion of the company, correct?
No, it's still the brothers doing their thing.
Is he still flying to this day?
Oh yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
Mark has a helicopter. He'll be like, I guess it's your prerogative when you run a company that is sort of hit its stride. He'll be like, yeah, I feel like going fishing, and he'll just jump in his helicopter and he'll fly to Florida. He'll fly to Alaska. He flies to Alaska and he'll
love
just like
that.
go there for a week. Yeah, but yeah, he'll just like hop in his helicopter and just like be gone.
Good
to go
for him.
fishing or whatever. Yeah.
So it's interesting because when I was reading the book, I to myself was like, I'll say, I'm like, oh, so much has happened. But I was like, okay, yes, I remember Obama was president, Ebola. But what kind of resonated with me was people that put this together and created a situation where I don't want to say it's a footnote, but I was like, oh, yes, Ebola, because you read into Ebola as I did before I got in here. Obviously, you hear Ebola and you're like, yeah, I wouldn't want Ebola. But it's like, what is it actually? An organ shut down, all that type of stuff. And so maybe could you talk a little bit? Because I'll just say, at least for my part of it, my edification was, yes, I was alive. Yes, I was around. Thank God there was people like the brothers to help shepherd us through the Ebola outbreak to make it that much less worse. But could you talk a little bit about the main premise of the book and the Ebola outbreak, and kind of, without revealing too much because people go read it themselves, but kind of what that exactly, for us like me, that doesn't exactly maybe remember it completely, but was like, yes, 2014, I remember now.
Yes. Ebola was discovered in 1976. Think about that for a moment. Like, it is a virus that's clearly been around since the dawn of time for reasons that, I don't know, that don't appear very apparent. We had never really stumbled upon it. But it generally crops up in incredibly remote places. Its kill rate is somewhere between 40 and 90%, depending on the situation. So a lot of times it burns through the local population very quickly, which is what happened in 1976. By the time people realized that there was a thing that was going on in Congo, everyone who could be killed by it basically had been. So for several decades, Ebola would appear, burn through its roster of potential hosts, and then go back under. And again, sometimes it would kill 40% of its victims, sometimes 80, sometimes 90. But so very little was understood about it. But there was this assumption that, like, oh, whatever it is, it comes from really remote areas. So West Africa, not very remote. It's coastal. There are three countries in particular, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, that are heavily populated, that all have major capital cities, million plus population, international airports. It was just not a place that people thought that kind of thing could happen. There are ponds in South Georgia where people swim and they get like flesh-eating virus. I wouldn't expect to get that in Atlanta, but there's this assumption like, oh, we're safe swimming here, as opposed to like
Right.
some kind of strange, backwoods water. That's essentially, people of West Africa did not feel that this was a virus that was going to touch them.
Wow.
December of 2013, a child gets sick, and within a couple of weeks, he's dead. He was being cared for by his mother and his sisters, his grandmother. Within a couple of weeks, they're all dead. So by early January of 2014, an entire family has been wiped out. People come in to attend the funeral, then they go back to their towns and villages. So the virus that began in this one tiny little place in Sierra Leone is now so that's the beginning of this thing. Nobody realizes what's happening because, again, West Africa is not a place that is considered, or was not up to that moment considered, susceptible to Ebola. So we get deep into the spring before anybody realizes really what is happening. And what is happening is that one of the deadliest viruses and least understood viruses was running rampant and unchecked through three separate countries simultaneously. Very quickly winds up being the deadliest Ebola outbreak in human history. So by the summer of 2014, the healthcare systems in three different countries had essentially collapsed. The local
Wow.
effort was completely being swamped by the number of patients coming in. Ebola is often referred to as the caregiver's disease because, you are at your most contagious when you're at your sickest. And that's when, you're going to be cared for. And it's a really difficult thing to avoid getting because, the tiniest little bit of a tiniest little drop of blood contains tremendous amounts of the virus. So if you take like much less infected blood is needed to get you sick, but each blood cell will contain significantly more virus than most other viruses. So it's like this sort of double whammy. And there was essentially no international effort at all to help. There were two different aid organizations, MSF, which here in the States we call Doctors Without Borders. Everywhere else it's MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, and a very small organization run out of North Carolina called Samaritan's Purse. It's run by Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son. They've been all over the world, but they had never treated Ebola. So they were running a hospital in Liberia, capital of Monrovia. They had a small clutch of volunteers, a dozen people, doctors, nurses. But, it's a city of 1 million people whose healthcare system had collapsed at that point. So they were also being overrun. So that's where you are, July of 2014. Two of the Americans who have volunteered there, one doctor, one healthcare worker, come sick with Ebola. So the one hospital, the sort of half dozen or so people who are treating a city of 1 million people, has an outbreak among its own, and two of them get sick. So there's this effort now, like we've got to get these people out of there. There's, if you look at the perfect storm, like, all those, anytime a ship, in American waters begins to sink, we send a tremendous amount of resources there to try to rescue. Well, something similar was going on, but nobody knew how to do it. I mean, this is an incredibly infectious virus. It's not something we understand. It is something we're terrified of. And you say the word Ebola, like anyone listening to this, you say Ebola, and like people, we all think the same thing, like blood from the eyes and liquefying and all this crazy stuff. I always say it's like that scene in Jaws where the mayor goes, if you yell Barracuda, everybody goes, huh? But if you stand on the beach and yell shark, then you have panic on the 4th of July. And so that's where we are, mid-July 2014. You have a little understood but very feared and very fearsome virus raging through three separate countries. It is killing not only the population, but it's also killing the local healthcare workers. Very few international experts have come in, but some of them are sick. And so the thinking is, if we want more people to come in and help, we can't just let them die. Like, we've got to try to figure out a way to rescue them. And so the question becomes, okay, how could we possibly get two people out of here with this highly communicable disease and get them to someplace safe? Like, what does that even look like? And that, that's the start of sort of the from that perspective, from the perspective of the patients, is like, what now?
Is that, I mean, obviously there's so much there to unpackage, but I guess from, that initial kind of, okay, we need to get them out of here. With Phoenix Air and what they have done in their past, were they, and, you said they started late 80s, we're in 2014. Have they done any transports of this kind, communicable diseases before? I know we've been talking a lot about explosives and that type of stuff, but you mentioned the tape on the floor. Were they ready and geared up? Or I guess in my mind, and I'm thinking, for our, obviously this story is way beyond aviation, but I'm thinking on the aviation side to it, logistically, we have a lot of people that think logistically, like, okay, you start going down the list and you say, how do I get these people back? And the first thing you would think is, why not a military transport of some kind? So at that point, did Phoenix Air have they done this in the past by 2014? And they were like, yeah, those are our people. Or was this a brand new mission on top of all the other very dangerous missions they had done up to that point?
Well, I will say first that if you talk to people in the government and the military, they will tell you, and I have for this book, they will tell you militaries do not want any part of infectious disease. It's just
Okay.
not what they do. Then they don't want, so they are very quick to kind of go like, what?
Right.
In fact, Germany tried for briefly to get something going, and it just kind of, the effort never really worked. So
Okay.
generally speaking, that's just not something they really want to be hip deep in. In terms of Phoenix, the answer is kind of yes and no. They had transported sick people. They had and a lot of, getting people in and out of difficult places, North Korea, war zones, hostage exchanges, all kinds of like dangerous, sort of their MO. Like, what is, there's conflict in Sudan. There are people who need to get out. Like, we're willing to fly in. Our pilots, our doctors, our nurses are cool with that. But they had not done a real communicable disease transport before. So if you go back to the tape on the floor, the genesis
Yep.
of that moment of people sitting around going like, how do we make this work? 2008, Dent Thompson gets his phone call from the CDC. And they just said, come down. We have to talk to you about something. So, like, you do this long enough, you get sort of weird phone calls from the government saying, we'll be there, or you come here. You understand that, like, okay, something's going on that they don't want to discuss over the phone. Like, how are we going to, he sort of understood, like, it goes something big, but he didn't know what. So he brings an engineer and a doctor, and he goes down, and they get to the CDC, and they're put in this room. And, more or less, they are told in pretty short fashion, like, hey, we send CDC, we send experts all over the world to fight outbreaks. At this point, there had been swine flu, bird flu, SARS. SARS is one of those things that, like, nobody really knows it very well, but like, if you
Yeah.
talk to an infectious disease expert, they will tell you, like, that's the one that keeps them up at night. That is the virus, because it's airborne, it's deadly, it's highly communicable. That's the one, like, if it ever really breaks out and it sort of cropped up once and then went away, and they all sort of say, we dodged a bullet. That's kind of the one that they all go, that's the one that'll wipe us out. Like,
Wow.
that
Wow.
movie Contagion, like, that's
Yeah.
how we'll all be. That's how that one's going to
Wow.
go. So there's real
Wow.
fear about that kind of thing. But, so they had been sending experts around the world. And at that point, their philosophy or their policy was something called treat and place. So let's just say you are an epidemiologist and you get sent to pick a country, China, Vietnam, Democratic Republic of Congo, and whatever it is that you're being asked to help with there, you contract. Policy was that you would stay where you are, resources would be sent to you, but you would stay there until you are better or dead. So if that's you going, you can say, okay, maybe I get better, but not all these people get better. So does that mean that I die overseas, that I die alone, that I die in some other place? Hell no, I want to die at home.
Yeah.
The brutal math of infectious disease is that people want to die at home. So they were beginning to have trouble with some of their experts being willing to go. And people are saying, I don't know, man, like, if my only option here is to die far from home, like, I'm not sure I want to keep going to these. And so they needed a way to get people back home, but they had no idea what that would look like. That sort of, transcontinental by air with a communicable disease, it just didn't exist. And so they said to Phoenix, like, you guys are kind of this weird Swiss Army knife. Can you figure something out? And Phoenix had an engineer by the name of Ricky Smith. Ricky is like he is mid 20th century aviation. He's from a small town.
Yeah.
And, if you talk to him, I said, how did you get into, because he was a pilot, he was a test pilot. And he became an aircraft engineer. I said, how did that happen? He's like, and he's from Alabama. He's like, well, man, you live in a small town, you want to fly, better learn how to fix your plane. And I was like, okay, that makes perfect sense. Like, there's nobody else to do it. So I guess I'm going to do it. And that was his avenue. But he's just one of those guys that, like, there's some people who just, like, if that's been your philosophy since you were a kid, then you either know your way around things or you get out of them.
He's their Alan
it's just
Shepard.
Exactly. Yeah. And so he was like, let me figure something out. So while people are talking, he begins to come up with the concept of what is essentially a tent. It's a biocontainment unit. It's got to be disposable, but it also has to be strong. Ultimately, when they go through the proving process for this, the FAA puts it out through all these, like, tremendously rigorous tests to make sure that in a crash or an emergency, that this tent's not going to fail and just release whatever contagion is inside out into the world. So he begins to develop this biocontainment unit, knowing in the back of his head, like, man, we don't have a lot of space to work with. We have a very short ceiling. We have, there's seats here, but we need equipment and we need room for the patient. We need room for the providers. Like, it's really, really, really confined space. So the parameters of this thing are punishing, but then so are the specs. An airborne virus, the reason it's airborne, so many things are, you always hear like somebody say droplet. It's spread by droplet versus airborne. Droplet, like, sort of in layman's, like, if we're going to really simplify it down, it just means like it's too big to float on the air. It's going to come out and spit. It's going to come out and sweat. So airborne, like, imagine how tiny, tuberculosis is to fly by air. It's incredibly small. So the filtering system you're going to need on this thing is incredible. Again, closed space, long distances, someone sitting in an aircraft, like, if you let that out,
Right.
by the time that thing lands, it's going to be a zombie apocalypse inside that jet. And so he begins developing what will ultimately become this first of its kind, never before seen airborne biocontainment unit. Basically, like, take what you have at USAMRIID, take what you have at the most advanced military base that you can wrap your head around, and now squeeze that down into a Gulfstream 3. And there's sort of a reason it'll be a Gulfstream 3, but it's the parameters are punishing, but that's the genesis of this thing. And so they, with the doctors, with the engineers, with the pilots, they create this system, which of course involves, like, reversing the airflow inside the plane, which is its own, kind of wild thought. But they develop it, and then they have like 6 prototypes. They package them, they stick them on a shelf. And there's this collective feeling of, like, dear God, I hope we never have to use that thing. Because, can you imagine climbing into, this thing where, it's got like a 5.5-foot ceiling, wide side to side, it's 3.5, 4 feet, length is 8 feet. And you're gonna be crawling into that thing with somebody who is actively dying of something really scary. And, all the doctors who were there were like, God, I hope we never have to unpackage this thing. So come July of 2014, the State Department comes calling and says, hey, you guys have it. Are you willing to unpackage it?
So that was 2008 when they started those conversations with the CDC, and from that, the next, I guess, 6 years roughly till the event happened with Ebola. To your point, it sat on the shelf. Now, I guess, is that kind of the thought? It took them about a year to develop, and then store, and then wait for the Ebola outbreak.
Yeah, it takes, they, the design, fabrication, approval, fix it,
Yeah.
sort of tweaking, all that stuff. It goes, to early 2010. And essentially they have these things at that point sitting on a shelf,
Is
waiting.
the fact that the brothers just happened to be next to, I think, the CDC's headquartered in Atlanta, right? I believe.
Mm-hmm.
That's just kind of, I don't want to say serendipity, but it's this, there was no late 1980s after they were like, hey, they started more DOD, Department of Defense, We got these contracts. CDC reached out to them and said, hey, we understand you guys. I'm making this up in Jeff Miller head, but we understand you guys are the master at, hauling dangerous stuff other people don't want to do. Uh, and that just kind of happened. They happened to be in the same state. They happened to be just north of Atlanta, and it just kind of worked out that way. There was no, I guess, pre-planning of future CDC involvement. It just happened like, hey, we're the guys in town. Our spirit is we'll do what needs to be done type of thing.
Yeah, the CDC had sort of been involved with them here and there. They had done some things for the CDC. Like I said, they were doing, sort of dangerous medical transports prior to that. So there were some things that they were doing that included CDC involvement. So they were a known entity, to the center at that point. Nothing on this scale. It was more, it was more sort of slightly more conventional. I mean, there was someone, the truth is, all right, I'm dancing around this a little bit because there was a lawsuit involved. So I don't want to be the one to say
Fair
it.
enough.
But there was a patient who had it wasn't something like Ebola, but he had a particular kind of disease and he needed to be transported, and he was. And so I think that was sort of the thing that brought them onto the radar.
Okay. Yeah. It's interesting because in all the time I've spent in this world, I know very little about the CDC's transport operations. Obviously you watch the movies, you mentioned like Outbreak, right? And they're involved and they seem like they have a fleet of aircraft in the movies, at least. And then the military, like what you referenced earlier, military saying like, be involved here. But that definitely for me, I love understanding that better because you see a lot of these, departments that have their own fleet, whether the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, whoever it might be. But you think about the CDC and you think about their mission, it does clue a lot in that, you have, kind of these independent contractors that are like, hey, you can probably do it quicker and faster than we can, better than we can. Go figure it out. And then it seems like that's kind of how things came about here a little bit is we're going to rely on someone who has the expertise. I may be paraphrasing, I may be completely off, but it generally sometimes in life, the government's like, hey, let's just stand out of the way and let these guys handle it because they're going to have the ingenuity to get. I mean, if you think about creating this, going from 2008 to 2010, that's pretty darn good. Very good, actually.
Yeah.
Especially in our world with the FAA involved, they've been working on prototypes for 10, 15, 20 years sometimes before anything happens. So I love the thought of that kind of ingenuity that it's like, hey, these guys, they'll get it done, type of thing.
Yeah. I mean, look, they did it. The same system is what created the hospital end of this. The CDC essentially saying like, hey, we need some place to bring our people. Where will we bring them? There was a hospital nearby, Emory University Hospital. He partnered with Emory to create a highly infectious disease unit. And you would think, in your mind, like maybe the CDC has one of these things. But it's sort of like you watch a cop show and the police are like sending things to the lab and there's like all these resources. But in reality, like, that's not how it works. Your city government doesn't have those sort of resources. It's like two dudes in a room, That's, so it's the same thing. The CDC sends people, but they don't necessarily have all these things. And so it's oftentimes cheaper, easier, smarter to have a company come in and say, well, hey, we can provide this one little piece right here so you guys don't have to do it.
No, that makes sense. You had mentioned the G3, the Gulfstream 3. I worked for a company in Florida that had a G3, and now that was configured for business travel. So I think it was like 8 passengers, fluffy chairs. You mentioned G3 specific aircraft for this operation. Now, in my mind, I start thinking, is that for range of, where the aircraft can go nonstop? But could you, for our listeners, because we have a lot of airplane nerds that listen to this, could you elaborate a little bit on if there was a specific purpose for the G3 being the selection for the prototype and this type of mission?
I mean, to a degree, you nailed it. A lot of it does have to do with the range. Prior to that, they were using Lears, they were using other stuff, but it was a lot of leapfrogging because things didn't necessarily have the range. And so they needed something a little bit better. The problem was the this is the same G3 you're thinking of. It is fluffy seats,
And
8 of them
okay.
in the back,
Okay.
totally. When they do a mission, their maintenance department runs in and is like ripping out seats.
Okay.
But it's the same thing. The problem with they had G3s, or they had a G3. The reason that they didn't use it for this kind of mission was, as you're aware, the location of the door, which sits behind the right seat. When you come in, you have to make a hard left to get to where, the patient compartment is. They couldn't do that with a stretcher. The door configuration, because of where the cabin wall is and where you turn to go, into the patient compartment, it was too narrow. It was so they could not get, and so it just was not the right aircraft for it. So they wanted to find a way, but they just couldn't. And so, and as as well, like, you don't cut into the side of an aircraft. Like, that opens up, that is a can of worms you don't really want to get into. Although they ultimately end up doing this, but, their department now, which is kind of crazy. But so Dent is, again, like everything with these guys is always, there's just something very A-team about the whole thing. It's just always crazy. He's on a boat on a lake in Georgia in, his bathing suit, and he gets his phone call saying, "Hey, do you want to buy an aircraft from the Saudis?" Like, that's how these things tend to go down. But basically what was going on, the Danish military, who oversees Greenland, as we all now know quite well.
We figured that out recently.
Yeah, now we know, we're a little bit more familiar with the geopolitics of Greenland.
Yes.
They were flying these sort of rescue missions over the coast of Greenland, and they had a very small fleet, handful of G3s that were made specifically for them. They didn't have serial numbers. They didn't exist in their, like, if you went to the Gulfstream catalog, you would not have come across them. These were not made for general aviation. They were made very specifically for the Danish military. It was a G3 in every way except for one. On its side, instead of that little door behind the right seat, it's got this massive cargo door. And that massive cargo door opens it up for everything. Now, suddenly, because you have a G3, which is, maneuverable, it's got range, it has all these great features that people like in a G3. Now it has this big cargo door through which you can put anything up to and including, and these guys do, a beluga whale. So, you can fit all sorts of things inside this jet. And they get a phone call. It's right around Christmas. So this is sort of preceding the lake thing. But they get a phone call. This is how they first found out about these things. The Danish government, one of their planes went down, and so they were going to change up their fleet, and they wanted to sell these things. And so these guys sort of swoop in very quickly. They buy the planes. They actually had to sign a contract saying that they wouldn't resell them because there was a real concern that they would fall into the hands of like drug dealers or something. Because again, it's such a versatile aircraft to begin with, and then you add the cargo door, and it becomes this unicorn essentially. And so they buy a couple, and it completely transforms their ability to do many things, including these really complicated medical flights. So that's how the G3 comes into it, is that cargo door. So you have a patient who is lying down, like I said before, you can't make that turn. You have somebody who is critical care patient and are on ventilators and drips and everything. You can't get them in. Cargo door changes all that. So they buy them. But the problem is there's very few of these in the world. And most of them, one of them was crashed off the coast of Greenland. The Saudis have one. There were a couple that were owned by the Indian military that were destroyed in an avalanche. Their hangar was crushed under a mountain of snow. So there just aren't very many of them in the world. And Phoenix buys the remaining group. And then ultimately, like I said before, they decide to begin modifying the aircraft on their own, and they create an aircraft modification unit within their company to begin doing that.
So we talked about the 2008, 2010 kind of developing of that area to hold, the person that has, a communicable disease or whatever it would be. But the purchasing of the aircraft, do you know when that kind of happened in the timeline?
That precedes the the development of the ABCS, the Biomedical Containment System. That wouldn't have been possible prior to the G3 with the cargo door.
Okay.
That's the aircraft that makes it all possible.
Yeah, they're obvious. Phoenix Air is operating those to today. So they're still operating the Gulfstream
Yep.
threes. Okay.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, it's impressive because I was in my side of the world. My day job where I work now. We'll see. They're up to the G800s now. And the Gulfstream that side to it, and what a story, a mission that goes along with it. Because when you think Gulfstream, right? And I was saying this the other day to one of their sales reps. I was like, all the old rappers are going to have to go back and change their songs because you hear like Ja Rule, he's like flying at my G2. It's not as impressive now. You gotta get your G8.
Nope.
But this side to it until you explained it, and our listeners, I'm sure for the most part, I did not know about this kind of hybrid approach and just what they were able to do with the mission. So when they reached out to kind of what you talked about, these governments, whether Greenland or India, it was Gulfstream's like, we're going to sell them. We're going to sell them to government entities. And the beluga whale was very interesting. So the thought process was, we could configure our aircraft in a way to help cargo operators, or at least in government capacity. Was that because I've dealt with
Yep.
Gulfstream a lot, and I've never heard it at all. Really, them focus on this side to it. So, but it's such an amazing part of the story, and especially from your book. It's such an amazing part of really making this all possible.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they kind of Phoenix jokes with Gulfstream that, like you guys didn't even realize what you created. You made a unicorn and then you didn't really follow up on it. Which is why they created their own fabrication department, is because they knew, look, there's only so many hours we're going to be able to get on these airframes. We're going to have to replace them. What do we do when that happens? Well, let's just make our own cargo door. And so they created an engineering department that fabricates its own pieces. They figured out how to, they brought in an engineering firm to say, like, how do we cut into the side of this aircraft? How do we do this? And of course, the people were like, you don't do that. Don't cut into the side of the aircraft. You're going to ruin its integrity. But, so there has to be a way to make it happen. And so they figured it out. So they do it. They create their own cargo doors now, which is, a really remarkable feat. And to go there and to see it. I mean, I encourage, if you're a real aviation enthusiast, these guys are proud of what they've done. They're proud of their little company. They will walk you through it. They will bring you right in and they'll say like, hey, This is how we do it. Here's the guy whose job it is to do this. I've seen it myself. It's a really cool thing to do. But yeah, that was how this thing got started, was an aircraft that is not in the catalog, that you can't get. Like I said before, they didn't, these things didn't have serial numbers. They weren't intended for civilian use. They were really like a very sort of niche military aircraft that, was really versatile and became this great thing for Phoenix. And, the beluga thing is really kind of a wild story, but
yeah, there's many. If you go back to Gaddafi, the whale, there's so much in here that you have, I think at least 2 more books out of this, maybe more.
I know. I mean, Mark, one of the 2 brothers, Mark, is always saying like, Ebola is not even the most interesting thing we did, which, I would agree. Like there are, you like, transporting Muammar Gaddafi, who, by the way, is like, I don't know how young your average listener is, but if you were not alive in the 1980s, I will tell you now that this guy was the world's premier terrorist in the 1980s. Like he was the leading state sponsor of terrorism around the globe. He was sort of thorn in the side of the West. He loved it. Like he was very bombastic and, just sort of florid in the way that he flaunted his terrorism credentials. And he made Libya this kind of odd, like he was a much more personable King Jong-un, essentially. Like he had this pariah state. He was really, he was eccentric and animated and very much an extrovert. He had nuclear weapons. And so, through this crazy story, Phoenix winds up transporting his nuclear weapons out of his country. Yeah, the whales and there's so many stories that, there were stories that they asked me, like I'd be having lunch with them and they would tell me something. And of course, I've got my recorder going, I've got my recorder going. And then their legal department is one guy. also a pilot.
Okay.
There's one guy, and he would say this like incredible story would come out, and he'd look at me and he'd go, "Please don't write that. Like we can't. That can't. Please don't. Please that can't. That can't come out because it's it's not like stories of like, aha, here's how we broke the rules. It's stories of like, this is some
Yeah.
crazy shit. Like you just kind of blown away that it happened. And he's like, yeah, maybe don't tell that one. It's just always heartbreaking. It's like you get handed a bicycle as a kid, and your dad's like, no, that one's not for you. We're gonna give you the Huffy. Stay away from that one.
Seems fair. No, it's funny because you would in their business, it's almost like everything that they do that's critical to probably our safety as a country or the world. It's like, well, if you want the business tomorrow, you probably just forget it ever happened. But I love that there is at least some of it that you can share with people because it is a captivating story. And I remember Gaddafi when he was, I think it was early 2000s maybe, when he would come to his state visits. If I remember right, he would like pitch a tent, and I don't mean like a regular tent, but like if I remember right, he wouldn't get a hotel. Yeah, he would like set up in Washington D.C. off the side of the road in like some giant tent with all his fine stuff. So I guess so I could talk to you all day long, and I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll try to get back to not necessarily taking away from the book because everybody needs to read the book, but I guess the details, at least up to the point of, we don't have to go all the way what happened so people could read through it and find out themselves. In 2014, they have the plane. They know how to transport someone. In theory, they haven't done it, right? It's been on the shelf since 2010. They get the call, and the call is go to Africa.
Yeah. And quickly, two people sick in the middle of an incredibly deadly outbreak need to be brought out. Nobody knows how to do it. The organization that sent them, Samaritan's Purse, was looking around. Nobody would allow them to land in their country. They couldn't find any place that would take them. They couldn't find a country that would allow them to use their airspace, which you just think about. Like, this virus was so feared, they said, no, you can't even fly over our country with it. Because obviously, if you're in our airspace, you have a problem. Where are you going? You're going down to our ground space. We don't want that. So they couldn't, so it was going to have to go over the Atlantic. It was going to have to come to the U.S. There was no other option. But nobody had that capability. That's a very long flight. And so there was a lot of question about how this was going to go down. And there was somebody at the State Department has this thing, which sounds like something out of a James Bond movie. It's called Operational Medicine, which sounds cool as hell.
It sounds like a movie.
Yeah, it does. It does. But, it's basically it's exactly what it sounds like. Quite frankly, it is a small group of people who specialize in making weird things happen in the medical sphere around the world. On our behalf. If you're a diplomat, they're there for you. If you're a U.S. citizen, they're there for you. I would suspect, though they don't generally talk about these kind of things, I would imagine that they're probably floating around right now through the Middle East with all these bombs going off in Iran. I'm sure that there are American citizens, there are American government and business leaders who are being taken out and brought someplace safer. Operational Medicine, Phoenix Air, these are the kind of people who make that happen. But there was somebody at Operational Medicine, a guy by the name of William Walters, who was familiar with Phoenix. Only in passing, he kind of knew their reputation. He had dealt with them once before, but not in any particular way. So there was just enough understanding of the two for him to know that Phoenix had this capability. But he didn't know if it worked. And so he calls Dent. So, imagine Dent's on vacation at the time. Imagine you are on vacation. You get a phone call from the United States State Department saying, 2 Americans are dying of Ebola overseas. We want you to go get them. You have basically 5 minutes to decide. We'll call you back. Click. That's an intense phone call, man. But that's how the whole thing gets started. And Ebola kills in a very narrow window. You have just over a week, and so by the time Phoenix is brought into this, these 2 people are several days into their window of survival. So if they're going to go, they're going to have to go very quickly. The government swoops in on the Phoenix Air airstrip, They figure out if this thing is viable. It's sort of through show of hands. They see, yep, it'll work. But you guys are going to have to be the ones to do it. The government was not involved. They weren't really prepared to step in at that point as a transport agency. So this is going to be basically a private interaction between, or a private transaction between two American citizens. And so has to do this, without any safety net. They only can transport one patient at a time. So if they do it, they've got to go twice. There's turnaround, as you know, there's mandatory downtime with pilots. So when they land, so think about this for a moment. You're a pilot, you're going in, or a doctor, you're going into one of 3 countries that is suffering the deadliest known outbreak of one of the deadliest known viruses. And you're going to have to stay there for your 14-hour mandatory downtime because those pilots can't fly out there, turn around and come back. So you have no choice. No, you are mandated to go and sit in a beachfront hotel in a country that is quite literally swimming in the scariest known disease imaginable for 14 hours. And those guys, they all talk about like how horrible that time was. And there's great stories of them like sitting in this hotel, like, sort of staring at this clock that is very slowly ticking, as all around them, the world is like a movie, like people in suits and, bodies being burned and just like the craziness of an outbreak of this scale. And they're just sitting in a hotel, like, should we order a pizza? And of course, like, who's going to hand you the pizza? Like someone living in a country that is, inundated with the, like it was, it's a wild, wild story. Yeah. But that's how it goes. Like basically from, hey, there's a thing happening. Are you willing to be involved? To, we are, like nipple deep in madness and we're flying back and forth over the ocean, is that fast? It all happens within the span of a couple of days.
What an amazing thought that, everybody's phone rings, right? And you're, oh, okay, what's this person want? But when their phones rings, Den, right? Den, is that his name? Den. When his phone rings, and he picks it up, it could be a whole litany of things that's good. What do you want? But they should give him one of those letters that they gave him to say, hey, these guys are okay. Just give it to the FAA and be like, hey, listen, I know I need crew rest, but I'm going to go over the Atlantic, so I'll nap on the way home. Don't worry about that. So, and looking into Ebola a bit after, looking one into your past, thank you again for the advanced copy of the book. From that time period, which I actually didn't know this till you said it earlier, that was the worst death rate of an outbreak of Ebola since I started in 1970, career, at least found in 1976, but up to that point or up till today, because it's generally a dozen to 100 cases a year in a normal year of Ebola, generally in countries in Africa.
Yeah, it pops up in such remote places. That's kind of, that was sort of like the blessing and the curse of Ebola. Blessing because it came in places where there weren't a lot of people. Curse because you don't really have an opportunity to figure out what it is and what's going on. The blessing and the curse of 2014 is it hits 3 separate countries. It becomes the largest outbreak in human history of Ebola. That's the curse. The blessing is that the world was able to, eventually the world sort of wakes up to what's going on, and comes in to help. And through that process of like studying, learning, that's when, vaccines and treatments and sort of some sense of, okay, this is when this happens, we do this. That really did not exist before 2014. There were some thoughts and some ideas. There are other hemorrhagic fevers. Hemorrhagic fever is not in and of itself, an anomaly, but Ebola, sort of like the great white of like, is a tiger shark deadly? Uh-huh. Is a hammerhead deadly? Uh-huh. Are they going to kill you just as fast as a great white? Yep. Are you as scared of a hammerhead as you are of a great white? Nope.
Right.
So, there are differentiations between them. But, there was some understanding of it, but there just wasn't a great understanding of what was going on. But so this one becomes the largest to date, the deadliest, and it's pretty scary. We've all seen, you see movies like Outbreak, movies like Contagion. We've seen, The Walking Dead and all these other kind of things that show like a society that sort of comes apart at the seams from some kind of virus. And then something like this happens, and, people living through it, man, they were like, that is a version of their reality. That is what it looked like. That is what it felt like. I mean, just flat out terrifying.
Yeah, I think with COVID and the pandemic, just off of our heels and that whole time and how people reacted to it and looking back on it and lessons learned and um, you know, I guess in like this case, one, I think it captivates because we all just, especially the younger generation. You mentioned people that listen. We do have a lot of younger people that listen. In that generation that maybe was about in school at that time or something, and their whole learning and the way they were, brought up in those formidable years was completely shifted from what we probably all remember of, those time periods. And so I do think the book's very captivating in that kind of sense because it does allow you to examine something kind of, okay, and this leads into the question, but lessons learned, and lessons learned, we're still figuring it out from the COVID side to it. But with Ebola itself is one still in existence. He said that these outbreaks that happen, but to the transporting side and taking a prototype that was developed over 2 years, now at 10, an aircraft that just happened to come about when you're in a bathing suit on a boat and you're like, hey, we're got a bunch of planes to sell. We're no longer shipping whales out. But all of that together, have they taken Phoenix Air, have they taken this now and said, okay, here's what we understand from doing this now. And I'm assuming this is the only time that you have a term for it and it's escaping me right now, but that containment area in my mind, like
ABCS.
ABC, okay, ABCS. Have they patented that? Are they letting other operators use it? Or is it still something that they're like, now that we have a better understanding of this, yep, we're committed to these missions moving forward. If it is some sort of a communicable disease, is that where are we at now in 2026 over a decade later?
They're basically still the only show in town.
Okay.
I was talking to one of the doctors who was involved in those early flights, and he said to me, as I mentioned earlier, like Germany flirted with it. He said other people have flirted with it. The fact is, it's hard to do, and it's not fun to do, and not a lot of people care to do it. It's not a thing militaries are interested in, and it's not a thing that, like, generally speaking, other companies are interested in. So they have remained the only show in town. After 2014, well, actually it becomes 2015 because by time, that outbreak winds down, it's 2015 that, they flew dozens of patients around the world during, through the course of that outbreak. The government does this thing called a hot wash, which is like, after action report. What do we do right? What do we do wrong? And I was speaking with the guy from State Department, Dr. William Walters. He's a career military guy. He's a physician, and he was in the State Department at the time this all went down. And he said the biggest problem was scale. We had the ability to fly one patient, period. And then you have that turnaround. You've got the downtime. You've got all this, like, everything that needs to happen in between. There just weren't. Like one person at a time. Even if you sent 6 jets, you're still just flying. Those are 6 jets to take one person. Like, scale was the problem. And so they developed this thing called the CBCS, which is containerized biocontainment system. And the idea is essentially it looks like a shipping container. It fits inside. They fit inside of like massive, like now we're talking like 747 huge, military sort of cargo ships or cargo planes. And they can fit multiple of these inside one of these massive jets, and they each one can handle 4 patients. But it is, like when you from the outside, it looks like something you would see on a cargo ship. Then you step into the inside, and it's like that crazy sterile white, and it's a biocontain. It looks like something that you would see out of a movie.
Yeah.
You expect to see like government people in big crazy suits. That's what this thing. So that's what they created out of that. And at the time that this containerized biocontainment unit was developed, those, if they were to launch all 4 of the ones that they had built, that would have represented more highly infectious disease bed space than it existed in all of the United States at that time.
Wow.
Just like mind blowing that
Yeah.
we were that far behind on how to, that we have this notion like, well, there's an ocean to our left and there's an ocean to our right, and we're going to be okay. But in a world in which every country has an international airport, there's no such thing as okay. Like things, whatever's out there is coming here, and that was a big lesson of COVID. But they used these in COVID as well, and
Oh,
that was kind of
interesting.
when they were. That's when they were tested. Yeah.
Okay, so they brought it back out since then. Phoenix Air did to or
Yeah.
I okay. Um,
Yeah.
so the book is obviously came out. When did it come out today or just recently?
Just recently,
Just
like a week
recently.
and a half ago. Yep.
I'll put it in the show notes as well, but the book is available normal Amazon, Barnes and Normal type of websites, locations.
Any place you get books, you can get this book.
Are you doing any guest appearances, signing of books, stuff like that? Do you have a schedule, a website that you put? I know you have a website. I looked at it, but do you put that together? Are you planning on doing kind of a book tour with it?
Yeah, I'll be in DC at Politics and Prose on April 17th, which is a Friday night. That's their big bookstore there in DC. But it's funny, so much of the book promotion now is done through stuff like this,
Yeah.
podcasts. I mean, there's like I have to actually not force, but I have to like take time now to listen to music, because if you find a podcast that you like, you just like it, like those stories. I mean, I get transported, in the
Oh,
same
it's
way that I can with music. And so, yeah, I listen to a ton of podcasts, and so I get it. Everybody does. And so a lot of it is this, which is actually kind of nice, because, previously you're like, I'm in St. Louis.
right.
I'm in here. Like, and sometimes you're like, how on earth did I get into this town? It's like, so you find yourself in weird places, but that's the next big one coming up is Politics and Prose. And of course, DC being sort of, you know, um, a big part of this whole story. That'll be a cool place to be.
No, I love that. Now, through this process, have you caught any sort of aviation bug? Do you envision Kevin Hazzard is going to be flying the friendly skies anytime soon?
Well, I'll say this. Toward the end of the book, there's a story of two guys flying into Bhutan, into that crazy, crazy airport that is so hard to get into, or you need a local to come in, and the radar doesn't work. So you got to fly by sight, and you're following this river. Like that alone, like if you're an aviation person, the story of how people get into and out of that airport and how dangerous it is, and like how skin of your teeth it is every time you fly in, that alone is worth the price of admission. But reading that, like, yeah, I mean, like part of me was like, man, and of course I've gotten to know all these pilots, and they're always, every time I talk to them, like, hey, what are you up to? And they're like, well, I'm flying to Malta tomorrow because I've got to go here, and I'm like, damn, you guys are lucky. So maybe I went in the wrong direction. You can't not, you watch these things take off, you see the people who are behind it. There is a sense of adventure and freedom that comes with it. You can't be around aviation without feeling those aspects of it that I think are big.
You still didn't completely answer if you're getting into it.
Look, I don't know if you want me flying. Like, I was a little dangerous behind the wheel of an ambulance. I don't know if anybody wants me piloting an aircraft, but
Maybe.
in the back with my peanuts.
I fly out of the airport I'm at here, and I always the two things. I always enjoyed taking up someone that wants to go up, that interest in flying, and there's such a joy there, probably a selfish joy of just seeing somebody so happy to go up in a plane like that. But the other part too is the solitude you talked about, because I too I find this format, one, I get to talk to people like you, and I love that so much because I get to, one, learn a ton of stuff that I didn't know, but also too, it allows me this kind of like cathartic part of having a space where now when you have like these formats we talked about earlier about the book tours and just traditional media, and I do like the idea that other people's stories can kind of resonate without someone in the middle kind of saying like, no, that's not something that we should put out, or that's not, what the market we're looking for. And so I do like how it's evolved. There's some things I don't necessarily like about where the media stake is, say today, but I do love that everybody, because I too, listening to podcasts, can be like, just the average person who has, whether they want, they're in a career like mine where they're like, hey, there's so many people with great stories, or someone like you who's putting this out there, and then like you can have your own avenue and conduit to say like, yeah, this is the way I want to do it. This is how I want to get the story out, and to share such an important role for someone like Phoenix Air and what they've done, because I don't want to say designed to be shadow work, but somewhat probably designed that. But
Mhm.
at the end of the day, we're so lucky to have people like that there, and I think also lucky to have people like you that are willing to go in and find like, hey, without you, the story would have just probably been lost to the annals of history and never there. But the overarching long-winded theme I was getting at here is there's so much of that today. But one thing that's very nice about flying when you're not taking someone up is it is kind of one of those true last places where you can be by yourself, if you want to, if you choose to. And so there is something from all the noise that makes it special. And stories like this, I know will captivate our listeners. And I'm looking forward to hearing all the comments that they have coming in, because it's just such an amazing, unique story, and I feel so honored that you're willing to share that with not only myself, but our listeners.
Yeah, man, it's wonderful to be here. It's great to talk to aviation people too. I spend so much time with medical people, just because my own background and just so many of my stories live in that world. It's nice to sort of approach it from the other side. But from Phoenix's point of view, you're right. So much of what they've done is not meant to be sort of, that tea is not supposed to be spilled.
Yeah.
Their government missions, and I think that was a big part of why the brothers were so eager to tell this, because they built this really unique, really incredible company. They've done amazing things that they'll happily tell you over drinks, but that they can't tell you on the official record.
Yes.
And this was one that they could. So this was the opportunity to say like, hey, this is our legacy. This is what we've done. And this is what, not just us, like in terms of, these two brothers, but like us in terms of like all the people who have worked for them through the years, everybody who's walked through their doors, has contributed to this thing. And that ultimately led to this unbelievable rescue mission that takes place over the course of, 10 days in 2014. And it's just, it's just like there are extraordinary people among us. Like everyone, you look out, like are all capable of these remarkable things. I mean, when I was talking to Mark, uh, he said, I could teach a monkey to land a plane. He said, that's not the difficult part. What I'm recruiting is your mindset. If you would be just as happy flying a shuttle from Dayton to Chicago, then you're not my guy, because you probably would not be willing to hop a plane into a shooting war in Central Africa. I need someone who's looking for adventure. I need someone who wants more than the ordinary. And the thing is, like, so many people are looking for more than the ordinary. We're
Yeah.
all out there. And, these are the sort of the stories that connect us.
Well, and that's an amazing point you make there at the end, because there are a lot of people that listen to this that are up and coming. Even in my day job here, we have a host of interns every year that are getting into the industry. The first thing that is said, oh, I'm going to get my license and work for the airlines, which of course is a great route. And, now it's actually turned around where there's good salaries to be made there. These kind of, maybe, I don't say unorthodox ways, but just general aviation as itself a lot of times is overlooked by pilots, and you can have such an amazing career. And I feel honored too when I get into rooms and I can hear some of the background on these things, because it is, if someone's, especially, if you're already going into aviation, you have somewhat of a spirit of adventure, but to take it to the next level and say, yeah, maybe that shuttle from Dayton to Chicago is not the route I want to go. So I love that you bring that up, because the people that often reach out to me and which way should I go? Like, go to Phoenix Air and help them with their mission, and maybe be the next person that helps transport. And I think at the end of the day, right, the title of the book, No One's Coming, but in reality, there's at least one group that's coming, right?
Yeah.
Have
Yeah.
you?
I mean, that title has a double entendre. The medical group has a big flag in their office that says, no one's coming. It's up to us. And so that's part of it. is just that like the pilots, the doctors, the
Yeah.
people who stepped off into this, like they were on their own. In much the same way, by the way, as the people who found themselves in a difficult place. Like, you have Ebola in Africa, and like the world's not necessarily going to come. And this represented people who are willing to go. People who were in fact willing to take that step. And so, it's just,
Yeah.
I don't know, incredible
Well,
story.
Kevin, is there anything I didn't ask you that you would like to say at the end here?
No, man, I think we covered it. I mean, this is really great.
Yeah.
I
Nothing more about
enjoyed
speed
every second of
humps?
this.
Nothing like that?
No, I think we adequately covered. As it turns out, there will not be a speed hump podcast, because I think that was just about all the world can handle.
It probably is. It probably is. But thank you so much. Book is out. I'll put the book in the show notes so people can go and find it and pick it up and read it. It is a fascinating read. I specifically didn't ask you about how things ended because I don't want to necessarily overstep your book. But it is a fascinating tale, so I hope people pick it up. And it's a great read on an airplane. I read it on an airplane. I read it to and from DC. Yep, I read it on United Airlines. And so it helped me as I was navigating the friendly skies. And whether you're in aviation or you're not in aviation, you're just medical field, it's just such a good read. And I really appreciate you sharing it with me and our listeners. So thank you so much for that, Kevin.
Yeah, man. Thank you. I really appreciate having me on.
It was a great interview, not only for aviation enthusiasts, but if you have any interest in kind of anything, really. But I learned so much about not only on our side of the fence, but things that happen within the medical field, how they necessarily operate with our logistics side of aviation. Thank you so much to Kevin for sharing his story, but also Phoenix's Air as well. It's a main part of No One's Coming, which, if you're like me and you want something to read on your next travel, go pick it up. It's available now. Links will be in the show notes, but No One's Coming can be found on places like Amazon and any of those locations. Please drop in, take a look at it, go over to Kevin's website. Fascinating stories. And I'll have to go back and read his first two books too, because there is some connection there to some of the stuff I've had in my previous life, which at least is of interest to me and some of the people that I've known that have been paramedics in our industry. It does show kind of that connection, right? We think about aviation being point A to point B, but sometimes it's that line between a crisis and a catastrophe. So thank you so much to Kevin for sharing their story with Phoenix Air. If you would like to be a guest, or if you have a guest idea pitch, you can email me at dapodcast85@gmail.com, or any other stuff you may want to say about Destination Aviation. I should at some point today be getting in the new challenge coins, so I'll be putting those up soon on the website. But thank you again for everybody coming along on this trip with us, and always tuning in and listening, and the comments. I really appreciate it. None of it works without people listening to what we have to say. So thank you so much for everybody for doing that. And until next time, my friends, I'll see you down the runway.